The story opens with a striking image. A colossal black number 1, embellished with a checkered pattern, commanding the screen. The author immediately draws focus to it, while a smaller section of the display shows view counts, each accompanied by the number 1. In the subsections, a short story is mentioned, one that, despite its lack of widespread popularity, carries a unique significance. The screen then expands, unveiling a window segmented into chapters, each marked by a single comment and a single view. This is the novel 3 Ways to Survive in the Apocalypse. The man reading the chapters can't help but wonder, why is no one reading this? It's a masterpiece. The novel boasts an impressive 3,149 chapters, with an average of 1.9 views and 1.8 comments per chapter. A young man sits on a train, squeezed between 2 passengers, his tired eyes fixed on his phone. He grips it firmly with both hands, his face etched with exhaustion. He reflects on how few would commit to reading 3,000 chapters, and though the novel was published over 10 years ago, today is the day he reaches the final chapter. With a tap, he selects chapter 3,149, which glows blue, indicating it's unread. The moment he's been waiting for has finally arrived. Suddenly, a massive skeletal undead with glowing purple eyes bursts forward, its movements swift and menacing. Swirling dust and debris trail behind it as it charges. More monstrous creatures emerge from the chaos, a dragon-like beast with scales glinting ominously and horned bear-like creatures with razor-sharp claws. They roar ferociously, their sheer power evident as they effortlessly behead the humans in their path. Amidst the carnage, a towering snake-like monster slithers into view, its eyes gleaming with malice. Other grotesque beings join the fray, their forms twisted and unnatural. Standing confidently in the midst of this chaos is a figure cloaked in white, gripping a long rapier. Their presence is calm, yet commanding, a beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness. Back on the train, the young man is lost in thought, reflecting on the moment he's been anticipating for a decade, the conclusion of the novel he's faithfully followed. But just as he reaches this pivotal point, the train, hurtling at breakneck speed through the subway tunnel, suddenly derails. Sparks erupt like fireworks as the metal screeches against the tracks, filling the air with chaos and panic. Amid the turmoil, a figure emerges, illuminated by the flickering light. A being with stark white hair and small yellowish goat-like horns, its presence both eerie and otherworldly. The young man leaps to his feet, his hands outstretched, his face a mix of confusion. A woman beside him clutches his hand, her expression filled with fear as the other passengers panic. The man grits his teeth, his gaze fierce, as he realizes the scene unfolding before him mirrors the novel he's been reading. The world of the story, he realizes, is becoming reality. Standing beside the woman, he watches in shock as a demonic figure with white hair and small horns materializes. The chaos around him solidifies his belief that the novel's world is bleeding into his own. Meanwhile, atop a high-rise building, a man clad in a bulletproof vest and military gear stands beside another figure wearing a cap, both gazing out over the sprawling city. Golden lightning crackles around them, its energy pulsating with raw power as star-like projectiles, resembling ethereal bombs, rain down from the sky, illuminating the night with their otherworldly glow. Below, the clash of 2 blades echoes with a deafening roar, a brilliant spark erupting into the air as the weapons collide. This moment marks the violent convergence of 2 worlds, their boundaries shattered by the force of the impact. The 2 figures stand at the heart of the devastation, their swords locked in a fierce duel. Each strike sends shockwaves rippling through the ground, tearing apart the earth and hurling fragments of stone and debris into the air. White and yellow lightning crackles from their blades, illuminating the chaos around them as they battle with unrelenting intensity. The man in the black cloak swung his sword in a powerful, sweeping arc, aiming to strike his opponent's knee. However, his attack was met with a resounding parry, the clash of blades sending a shower of sparks and a burst of light into the chaotic surroundings. His face was a mask of determination, his eyes sharp and intense, while strands of hair danced across his face, illuminated by the blinding flashes of light and the swirling sparks that filled the air. Frustration boiled within the cloaked man, his anger palpable as he raised his voice, demanding to know the identity of his opponent. Yet, the figure before him remained unnervingly calm, his expression unreadable, his movements fluid as he effortlessly deflected another strike. The serene demeanor of his adversary only stoked the cloaked man's fury. Sparks and radiant light continued to engulf the battlefield as the calm opponent, with a swift and calculated motion of his blade, forced the cloaked man to retreat. With a composed stance, he pulled his sword behind his back, standing tall and unshaken amidst the crumbling world, the air around him thick with dust and the glow of embers. Nearby, a man in a bulletproof vest stood with a stern yet composed expression, his rapier gripped firmly in hand. He adjusted his hold, pulling the weapon slightly back as his sharp eyes scanned the devastation surrounding him. Dust and fragments of stone swirled in the air, creating a chaotic, hazy veil that obscured the battlefield. Another figure in the scene grinned mischievously, his face glistening with sweat as sparks and debris flew around him. He panted heavily, his energy spent, but his spirit unbroken. In his hand, he held a phone, his thumb hovering over chapter 3149. The chapter, still unread, glowed with a soft blue light. With a heavy sigh, he admitted to himself how nervous he had been about finally reaching this moment. Bringing the phone closer to his face, he stared at the screen with a mix of excitement and relief. Yet, as the initial thrill faded, a subtle sense of disappointment crept in. Tapping the screen with 2 fingers, he watched as the chapter title lit up once more. It struck him then that he might be the only reader who would ever witness the conclusion of this world's story. Above, the sky had darkened, save for a few gray clouds drifting lazily. Tiny particles of dust, or perhaps delicate silken bubbles, floated aimlessly through the air. In the distance, a group of young people, dressed in an array of styles, stood as if on water, their silhouettes framed by the setting sun. The horizon burned with a bright yellow glow, casting an almost surreal, dreamlike atmosphere over the scene. On the phone screen, the story 3 Ways to Survive the Apocalypse was displayed. The text explained that while there were multiple ways to endure the catastrophe, the author had forgotten them, yet reassured the reader that survival was inevitable. As the narrative reached its conclusion, a notification appeared on the smartphone. Final chapter. The young man stared at the screen, his grip tightening around his phone. His mind struggled to process what he had just read and what it meant for the world he lived in. Then, almost instinctively, he began scrolling, up, down, anywhere, but the page remained frozen. His breath quickened. "Is this seriously the end?" he muttered under his breath. After a moment, he exhaled sharply and stilled his hands. There was no use. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he leaned back against the train seat. Wedged between 2 passengers, a bag resting on his lap, he held his black smartphone in both hands, his expression hovering between disbelief and silent contemplation. Eventually, he shifted to gripping the phone with just one hand, his free hand lingering midair, uncertain of its purpose. Outside, the train hurtled forward, its motion a blur against the rushing wind. His thoughts drifted. He often introduced himself as Kim Dokja, but most people misunderstood him. He pictured an old memory, standing before a man with a notebook, who remarked that he was an only child. "Yes, but that's not what I meant," Kim had replied, clarifying his words. Another memory surfaced, a business card, crisp and neatly printed, with an employee's name emblazoned across it. The man who handed it over introduced himself as Kim Dokja, explaining that his father had chosen the name as a reminder to endure, even in solitude. Kim had merely scratched the back of his head, feeling the weight of that sentiment. His life had followed that principle to the letter, a bachelor's existence, unremarkable yet predictable. The businessman, adjusting his glasses, had simply nodded. "I understand." This was Kim Dokja in a nutshell. 28 years old, a graduate of a third-rate university, a contract employee at a subsidiary of a large corporation. His one pastime? Reading serialized web novels on the subway during his commute home. Now, on the train, Kim sat hunched slightly forward, fingers gripping his phone with an unusual intensity. Reading web novels had been his daily escape, a mindless habit during his commute. But today was different. Something felt off. As he stared at the screen, bewildered, a single thought pressed into his mind. This isn't like before. Kim stared blankly ahead, his mind still tangled in confusion, when a voice suddenly cut through his thoughts, teasing that if he kept staring like that, he might get sucked right into his phone. Startled, he snapped his head up, fingers still clenched around his smartphone. Standing before him was a young woman with striking orange hair, her warm smile effortlessly drawing him back to reality. One hand rested lightly against her ear, her expression bright and cheerful. He recognized her instantly. Yu Sanga from the HR department. His thoughts scrambled to catch up. He hadn't expected to run into her here. She asked if he was heading home. He quickly replied that he was, then realizing how abrupt he sounded, returned the question. His voice carried an edge of nervousness, as if he were still adjusting to her sudden presence. With an easy smile, she slid into the empty seat beside him, placing her bag neatly on her lap. She remarked that he was lucky today, since the relationship manager had gone on a business trip. Kim stiffened slightly, shifting inward as if to make space, though the train's seating offered little room for such an adjustment. He was still reeling. Why was she sitting next to him of all people? He kept his grip on his phone, unsure where else to direct his hands, the casualness of her presence throwing him off balance. As she settled in, he caught a faint floral scent drifting from her, light yet distinct. His eyes flickered to her hair, sleek, perfectly in place, as if not a single strand dared defy its arrangement. He sat stiffly, feeling a mix of surprise and awkward self-consciousness. Running into Yu Sanga, arguably the most popular woman in the company, on a packed subway train, felt almost too surreal to be happening. She rested her hand lightly against her cheek, gazing ahead with a calm expression. Searching for something to say, Kim asked about her commute, but his mind was already jumping to another thought. Didn't she get offered rides home all the time? He imagined the finance manager or even the deputy director casually offering her a lift. It seemed far more plausible than her taking the subway home alone, let alone sitting beside him. At his question, she lowered her head slightly, her hands resting on her bag. With a quiet sigh, she explained that her bicycle had been stolen. Kim turned toward her, a flicker of concern crossing his face, and asked if she usually biked to work. She nodded, mentioning that with all the overtime she had been putting in, she wasn't getting enough exercise. There were still a few tedious tasks waiting for her, but she had thought biking was a good way to stay active. Her voice carried a hint of frustration, and Kim felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Yusanga turned to the side, her smile bright enough to shift the atmosphere around her. Kim, still seated, tilted his head slightly, an awkward, self-conscious smile tugging at his lips as he clutched his phone. Seeing her up close, he began to understand why so many men in the office seemed so drawn to her. But almost immediately, he reminded himself that her world was different from his. And yet, no matter how much he reasoned with himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that today was unusual. And it wasn't just because of her. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an unfamiliar language. Beside him, Yusanga held a white phone in both hands, her mouth slightly open in surprise. A moment later, she explained that it was Spanish, translating the phrase as, "Can you lend me some money?" Kim turned his head slightly, still holding his own phone, caught off guard. She was even studying on her way home? The realization reinforced how different their worlds were. With a quiet sigh, he closed his eyes briefly before refocusing on his screen. Holding his phone in front of him, he murmured that she was incredibly diligent. At that moment, Yusanga leaned toward him, curiosity lighting up her expression. Tilting her body closer, she glanced at his phone. "By the way," she said, her voice laced with interest. "You seem to be reading something really intently, too." She remained there, leaning in his direction, waiting for his response with wide, inquisitive eyes. Kim, momentarily flustered, lifted his phone slightly higher as if shielding the screen. Displayed in bold letters was Chapter 1 of The World After the Apocalypse. A sheepish smile crossed his face as he admitted that it was a novel, his way of learning Korean, in a manner of speaking. Yusanga's eyes sparkled with excitement, her lips curving into a radiant smile. Without hesitation, she declared her love for novels, her enthusiasm unmistakable. She eagerly listed some of her favorite authors, Murakami Haruki, Raymond Carver, and in the same breath mentioned Han Kang, while casually asking about Kim's own preferences. A quiet panic settled in his chest. Turning away slightly, he gripped his phone a little tighter. Of course, she's read those authors, he thought. Letting out a nervous laugh, he admitted that she probably wouldn't recognize the authors he read, even if he named them. Inwardly, he made a firm decision. She could never know. He would take to his grave the fact that he was completely engrossed in the world after the apocalypse. Some things, he decided, were better left unsaid. Staring straight ahead, his expression hovered somewhere between disbelief and quiet dread. He was still processing what had just happened. It was true. His daily ritual consisted of reading web novels during his commute. But for the first time, he felt strangely exposed. The screen of his smartphone displayed several titles, his finger hovering uncertainly over one of them. A familiar pang of embarrassment settled in his chest. Sharing this part of his life with others had never been easy. But tonight felt different, and not just because of the unusual encounter on the train. The real reason was far more significant. After more than a decade, the story he had followed religiously, 3 Ways to Survive in an Apocalypse, or simply Ways of Survival, was finally coming to an end. In his mind, he pictured the screen of his phone, the chapters of his favorite novel lined up neatly in a list. Each one bore the same lonely marks of obscurity. A single comment, a single view. Most people wouldn't understand why this mattered so much, but to him, it was everything. He had been reading this story since middle school, when he was still just a boy. Memories began to surface, sharp and vivid. He saw himself in his childhood bedroom, hunched over his phone, surrounded by a chaotic mess of clothes and a half-open school backpack. Even back then, when school had been nothing short of a battlefield, this novel had been his refuge. Another memory unfolded, sitting on a worn bench, his phone gripped tightly as strangers milled around him, lost in the pages of a new chapter during his short breaks. Then came the bitter recollection of failing his entrance exams, landing him in a third-rate rural university, a detour he had never planned for. He pictured himself at his desk, clad in a stiff military uniform, hair cropped short, eyes fixed blankly on the computer screen. A bureaucratic mix-up had sent him straight to the front lines, a period of his life he preferred to leave buried. Mandatory military service was a reality for all South Korean men. But for Kim, it had been just another chapter in a life that often felt dictated by forces beyond his control. Now, seated on the train, he held his phone firmly in front of him, his expression unreadable. His thoughts drifted to his current reality, an unstable contract at a branch of a large company. What was the point of dwelling on anything else? Either way, there wasn't a single moment in his life he could call truly happy. Yet, as Ways of Survival approached its final chapter, an unfamiliar mix of emotions stirred within him. A deep sense of loss at the story's impending conclusion, but also a quiet satisfaction at witnessing it reach its end. Today, the epilogue would be released. Kim remained motionless, the world around him fading into background noise. His phone sat rigidly in his grip, his fingers pressing into the edges. He thought about the sheer scale of the novel. 3,149 chapters, a journey spanning more than a decade, one that had carried him from youth into adulthood. The sheer dedication behind it was almost unfathomable. For over 10 years, the author had written tirelessly, releasing chapter after chapter, with an audience that never grew beyond a single reader. And Kim had been that reader. His smartphone screen glowed softly, displaying a page filled with scattered comments. Among them was his own, a message of gratitude expressing how much he had anticipated the epilogue. He wished he could do more, that he could donate to support the author, but his meager salary made that impossible. Instead, he had poured his appreciation into his words, hoping they would be enough, hoping they would somehow convey the depth of his gratitude. Kim sat on the train, his smartphone still in hand, his mind drifting back to the times he had tried to promote ways of survival on recommendation boards. Every attempt had been met with disdain. People dismissed it too quickly, unable to see past the slow start, unwilling to give it the patience it deserved. To him, it was a masterpiece, but no one else seemed to understand. His thoughts scattered as Yu Sanga, seated beside him, suddenly turned toward him and called his name. He blinked, snapping back to the present, confusion flickering across his face. Realizing he had lost track of their conversation, he searched for something to say. He mentioned how quickly time had passed, noting that it had already been a year since they started working at the company. The words felt hollow, a last-minute attempt to fill the silence. Yusanga immediately picked up on the awkwardness, but responded with an easy smile. Sitting next to him, she let out a light, genuine laugh, her eyes crinkling as she closed them. There was a warmth in her expression, a shared nostalgia for the uncertainty of their first days at work. Kim found himself laughing too, the sound coming naturally despite the weight pressing on his mind. He agreed, recalling those early days as if they had just happened, then quietly acknowledged that their contract period was nearly over. Yusanga's expression shifted abruptly, surprise and fear flashing across her face. Kim noticed the change immediately, and in that moment, he suddenly remembered. Her promotion had already been confirmed. She had been recognized for her performance and given a full-time position. The realization settled uncomfortably in his mind as he sat there, scratching the back of his head, forcing a laugh to mask the awkwardness. He had completely forgotten to congratulate her. A sheepish grin crossed his face as he admitted to himself that perhaps he should have put more effort into studying other languages or improving his skills. Yusanga placed a hand on her chest, her tone modest as she downplayed the achievement. It wasn't just about language proficiency, she explained, but also performance reviews, effectiveness, and various other factors. Leaning back slightly, she rested her hands on the bag in her lap, her gaze fixed ahead, her expression now touched with a hint of worry. Kim sat in silence, unwillingly acknowledging a thought that had been lingering at the back of his mind. If this world were a novel, someone like Yusanga would undoubtedly be the protagonist. She worked hard, studied diligently, and even used her free time to read web novels as a way to improve herself. Meanwhile, he had spent years doing the bare minimum, letting life drift past him. It was no surprise that she had secured a stable future, while his own contract was likely nearing its end. Yusanga turned toward him, her mouth slightly open, a bead of sweat trailing down her cheek. There was hesitation in her eyes, but also determination. Kim, sensing her uncertainty, looked down in surprise, silently urging her to continue. Without missing a beat, she offered to show him the app she used for studying, her voice steady despite the apprehension in her expression. His gaze snapped up, eyes widening with incomprehension. The words hung in the air, but his mind had already wandered elsewhere. He imagined his life belonging to a different genre, something beyond the mundane reality he inhabited. A cricket, frozen in place, its tiny legs gripping tightly as if holding on for dear life. Across from it, a boy sat with a net and a plastic container, the green lid sealing in a handful of captured crickets. If his life weren't grounded in realism, what would it be? Fantasy, perhaps. He remained motionless, hands resting on his knees, gaze fixed ahead as though bracing himself against the weight of his own existence. Thoughts swirled in his mind, weaving together a fragmented picture of what could be. If his life were a story, he reasoned, maybe he would be the protagonist. The train jolted sharply, shaking from a sudden turn, snapping him back to the present. Yusanga's voice reached him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He sat rigidly, his expression unreadable, reassuring her with a serious nod. She studied him, her lips slightly parted as if searching for the right words. But he had already retreated into his own reasoning. Even if she showed him the app, it wouldn't change anything. His life was firmly anchored in realism, bound by its unyielding constraints. In this genre, he wasn't the protagonist, just a reader. Bowing his head slightly, he murmured to himself, a quiet acknowledgement of the role he had come to accept. A reader lives the life of a reader. Yusanga seemed taken aback by his words, her gaze fixed ahead in momentary confusion. Then, as if steeling herself, she clenched her fists in front of her, confidence settling into her features. With quiet resolve, she declared that if he lived the life of a reader, then she must be living an ivory life. Kim turned to her, his mouth slightly open, utterly baffled. The words made no sense to him, and for a moment, he simply sat there, trying to process what she had just said. The conversation had taken a turn he couldn't follow, leaving him stranded in its wake. Beside him, Yusanga remained still, her fists still clenched, eyes locked forward, mouth slightly open, as if lost in thought. Determination radiated from her as she spoke again, this time softer, but resolute. This was how she should approach everything, she mused, devoting herself completely, just as Kim did with his reading. She would imitate his focus, his dedication. Kim, however, had already turned away, his tired eyes fixed on the empty space before him. At least it was quieter now. The thought came as a small relief. Leaning forward slightly, he adjusted his grip on his smartphone, both hands wrapped tightly around it. The screen lit up suddenly, the device vibrating sharply in his grasp. His attention snapped to it, a flicker of curiosity breaking through his detachment. A message, one he never expected to receive. Opening the chat, his eyes widened in disbelief. The sender, TLS-123. The message, a simple yet profound expression of gratitude. Kim stared at the screen, his mind reeling. His fingers moved before he could think, quickly typing out a response. Was this really the author of Ways of Survival? The reply came almost instantly. Yes, it was them. And more than that, they had been able to finish the story because of Kim's support. The novel, the one he had followed for over a decade, had won a competition. Kim sat frozen, one hand gripping his phone while the other covered his mouth, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and exhilaration. A bead of sweat rolled down his cheek as the realization settled in. His favorite novel had won a competition, and he was speaking directly to its author. The weight of the moment pressed against him, his thoughts racing as he hurriedly typed a congratulatory message, his fingers shaking slightly over the screen. When he asked about the competition, TLS-123 responded, explaining that it was a lesser-known contest and that the novel would soon be monetized. A brief pause followed before the author added that monetization would begin once the epilogue was released. Then, almost hesitantly, he asked for Kim's email, wanting to send a gift as a token of gratitude. Kim's mind reeled at the unexpected offer, his grip tightening on his phone. At that moment, a figure materialized before him, a presence unlike anything he had ever seen. Short white hair, small, rounded yellowish horns reminiscent of a goat. The sight flickered at the edge of his vision, surreal, yet undeniable. Something about it unsettled him, but his attention quickly snapped back to his phone. Urgently, he typed a message to TLS-123, seeking clarification about the gift. The author's reply arrived almost immediately, filled with gratitude. It was because of Kim's unwavering support, the message explained, that the story had been able to take shape and come to life in this world. Kim stared at the words in silence, his mind struggling to grasp their full meaning. He lifted his phone slightly, his gaze unfocused as he replayed the conversation in his head. My favorite novel won a competition. The thought alone felt surreal, but something gnawed at him, a suspicion that the author was downplaying the achievement, perhaps out of humility. Maybe the novel wasn't as obscure as it once seemed. Beside him, Yusanga remained quiet, unaware of the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Then, his screen lit up with a notification, an email, the sender, TLS 123. His pulse quickened as he opened it, scanning the message. The author confirmed that monetization would begin soon, and that this would help him tremendously. Kim's heart pounded, his eyes darting to the time display. 6:55 p.m. The event, whatever it was set to happen at 7 p.m. Only 5 minutes remained. Kim held his smartphone in one hand, the other resting thoughtfully against his chin as he scrolled through his screen. A slight furrow formed between his brows as he decided to check his favorites list. His gaze sharpened when a notification appeared. The novella you are looking for cannot be found. A flicker of unease passed through him. That was strange. Novels slated for monetization were never removed without prior notice. His grip on the phone tightened as he tried to make sense of it. Before he could dwell on it further, the lights in the train flickered violently before cutting out entirely, plunging the carriage into sudden darkness. A low, unsettling sound rippled through the air, distant yet unnervingly close. Yusanga, momentarily absorbed in her phone, snapped her head up, her eyes widening with confusion. She searched the dimly lit surroundings for an answer, her breath hitching slightly. Kim, equally unnerved, followed her gaze, his own phone still clutched tightly in his hand. The air in the carriage grew heavy with tension as the train screeched to a jarring halt, leaving them both in eerie silence, waiting for some sort of explanation. Then, without warning, the train jolted violently to the side. In the chaos, a voice cut through the noise, shouting, "Terrorists are on the train!" Panic surged through the passengers like wildfire. Screams erupted all around them, with people clutching anything they could find, desperately trying to keep themselves steady as the train lurched and twisted, careening out of control. Amid the chaos, a strange, monstrous figure emerged from the shadows, its face twisted into a grin that revealed sharp, gleaming fangs. It let out a deep, unsettling sigh, its presence sending a wave of dread through the air. The train came to a violent halt, the screech of metal against metal mingling with the thick plumes of smoke and showers of sparks that erupted in all directions. As the time on his smartphone switched from 6:59 to 7 p.m., Kim's eyes widened in realization. The moment of monetization had arrived. It's 7 p.m., he thought, a sense of disbelief washing over him that he had caught the exact second it happened. But before he could process his thoughts further, an urgent announcement blared through the train's intercom, demanding that all passengers evacuate immediately. Yusanga, still sitting, turned to Kim, her mouth agape in shock and fear. Kim, frozen in place, mirrored her expression, fear and confusion taking hold of him. As he turned his head, a sudden, blinding red light flared up in the middle of the carriage. It crackled with energy, like a bolt of lightning, its brightness so intense that everyone instinctively shielded their eyes, hands raised to protect themselves from the blinding glare. Kim slowly lifted his head, his hand still partially shielding his face, his eyes fixed ahead in stunned silence. The red light pulsed and crackled, casting an eerie, unnatural glow that filled the entire carriage. His thoughts whirled, struggling to make sense of what was unfolding, but all he could do was watch, transfixed by the bizarre scene before him. The passengers, including Kim and Yusanga, stood frozen, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and fear. A voice suddenly echoed through the train, its tone cold and mechanical. The free service of Planetary System 8612 has been terminated. The main scenario will now begin. The words lingered in the air, heavy with an ominous weight, as everyone grappled with the reality of the situation, their minds unable to fully process the strange turn of events.